in most of our apps, we're gonna have some pages that some users, let's say admins, are able to see, and other pages or parts of our application that other types of users, like standard, normal types of users, aren't allowed to see, or just pages that logged in users can see and logged out users can't see. So the most simple, typical example of something like this is like an admin dashboard sort of page where I can view all of the users who are in my application, and I can add new users as well here. So this is the sort of page that you might build for yourself when you are developing an application, right? Where you can easily see the data in your app. And this page, by the way, is from the Basis Foundation template. Totally free, very simple kind of boilerplate template designed to be used with the Basis extension link down in the description. Now, the question that we are faced with is, how do we protect this page from people who aren't supposed to use it? So I'm going to stick with the example of having admin type users and then basically everybody else. So just starting with the data structure, we've got a simple data structure here out of the box where a user has a role, and a role is from an option set, and we've got 3 types of roles here, okay? So I want to basically have some kind of conditional logic that only makes this page accessible to admins. Now, one of the first and most typical kind of techniques that you'd think of is just hiding all of the content here on the page unless a user has the right role, right? So I could, on this body group, which is encompassing everything within the page, I could make it invisible on page load, and I could have some kind of condition that says when the current user's role is admin, and only in that scenario do I want to make it visible. And since right now I'm logged in here as a standard type user, I'm not able to see anything. And what's actually quite interesting is even if you go into the sort of the dev tools here and you actually dig in and see, okay, is the content there, but it's just hidden? It's actually not. It's actually, Bubble is actually waiting to render the HTML, right? The underlying structure of this content until some condition makes that content visible. But it's still not 100% secure. I'm going to get into why in a minute, okay? Better and actually essential is to have some kind of privacy rules that prevent any user aside from an admin from seeing any sensitive data to begin with. That's independent of any particular page that you might have in your application. You want to have those privacy rules set up, right? That's just like security 101. So you'd want to have a privacy rule here that could say something like an admin, and the admin type user, we could say when the current user's role is admin, okay, then they can basically do everything. They can view all of the fields related to a user. They can find users in the database. That's fine. And when it's maybe the user who's actually logged in, they can view all of the fields related to their particular data type. And then everybody else doesn't have any permissions, right? Unless you meet one of these criteria, then you are not going to be able to view the user's information. And so if I made this page visible again, right, we'd see that actually we can see all the content here, but none of the users are coming through. I haven't changed anything to do with the search constraint on this repeating group here, right? This is just doing a search for users. I haven't changed anything here. All I've done is change the privacy rule, and that's preventing any of the users from coming through into the table. So you definitely want to do that kind of stuff. But it's not just necessarily about data, right? It's also about logic and workflows. I don't necessarily want a non-admin type user to be able to execute a workflow here. So what we could do is add a condition, not to this button here, which is actually all it's doing is showing the pop-up, but we actually want to add it to this button within the pop-up itself, right? And we actually don't so much want to add a condition to this button itself for reasons I'll get into in a minute, but we actually want to be focusing on the sensitive actions themselves, right? None of this stuff is actually sensitive, like hiding the pop-up after we create an account for someone or resetting the data or showing a notification. But setting a password, reset email, yeah. Creating the account for somebody else, yeah. So this is where we would want to say something like, hey, when the current user's role is admin, only then do we want to fire this. And the same thing over here. Okay, the same thing over here. Now, why have I insisted that we add it to the action here and not to the workflow. So let's plant a flag. Let's remember to come back to that question, okay? Because before we get there, I want to explain sort of something about the way that your website is actually being served, the way that people are actually interacting with it. That's going to let us have a little bit more insight into the way that we're going to secure things. And the vehicle that I'm going to use to explain that is by going through kind of one other scenario where we would secure this page. So we've gone through, like, you could hide stuff, but that's not necessarily secure. We don't yet know why. We're going to get to that. We've gone through why we could add some conditions on these actions, and that is secure, but we're not quite sure why. But when we're dealing with whole pages that we want to lock off to certain types of users, okay, kind of the most comprehensive way of protecting them is actually by redirecting the users who aren't authorized as soon as they hit the page. So basically, we would do a pages loaded action, and we'd say, hey, we're going to navigate you to some other page. Let's say navigate into the index page, and we're going to do that only when the current user's role is not admin. And that means that as soon as I load this page now as my standard type user, I'm going to be navigated back off of that page, okay? Why is that okay to do? Now, what the heck's going on here, right? I'm just showing you like 3 different techniques for securing a page and not really giving any explanation as to why any of them are actually secure. So let's get into that. I want to introduce you, if you're not already familiar, with the concept of a client and a server. And the client is the same thing as your browser. I'm going to write here, client browser. And the server is the same thing as essentially your Bubble apps database and all of what is called the backend logic, okay? What happens when somebody visits your website, right? When they type in yourwebsite.com, okay? What's actually happening there is their machine, which we refer to in this relationship as the client, but you can also think about it as their browser. That's the software on their actual machine that's making this request. Ultimately, that is where the request to view a web page is originating from, okay? So we can think of it like this, where there's a request to view a web page, okay? What's happening is when you type in www.yourwebsite.com, okay, the server, which is this repository that encompasses everything to do with your application, right? All of its data, all of the logic, the UI, everything that you've configured, you can think of it as living nice little packaged folders and code on the server. And all the server's doing is just waiting for somebody to say, hey, can you send me all of the information related to this app because I want to view it? Basically, the browser is a special type of machine that knows how to make sense of the information that the server is going to respond with, right? It's going to respond with your app's code, okay? Remember, code really is just nothing more than the information that your browser needs in order to actually render a web page, right? In order to render what it looks like, how it behaves when the user interacts with different components, the different data sources that it needs to function. It's an interpreter. The browser is an interpreter for that code. It's nothing really different than a light source is an interpreter for electricity, right? The electricity comes from some source. When you turn the light switch on, you make a request essentially to the local grid to give electricity to you, to turn it on and provide it to this particular outlet, which we call a light, or in this analogy is the same thing as the browser, who then interprets and transforms it into a useful form, i.e. the light that's emitted or the web page itself, all right? Now, this relationship is very important to keep in mind because by very nature, once this app code arrives on your machine or arrives in the browser, okay, even if it's not in a format that you'd just be able to understand from looking at it, okay, in theory, somebody who does know how to interpret it can access everything. That means that everything that hits your browser is all the information that's encoded in those files in that code base is inherently insecure, okay? So we don't want to be sending anything sensitive in this code base, in that package that is your web page. We don't want to be sending anything that the user who's requested to view it isn't able to see, okay? And that's why something like privacy rules is really important, right? This is not a tutorial on privacy rules. I've got another video on that, which I'll link to. But that's why privacy rules are so good, because they are a filter on what data can be returned to the browser from the server, right? The privacy rule is basically a condition or some logic that the server uses in order to decide, hey, even if the user's requested this information, do I have a privacy rule that's going to allow that user to actually get that information? And if they don't, that information never leaves the server, right? The server, by very nature, is something that the user never has access to, right? It's literally a locked behind a door or a series of doors, right? Because in the modern web, you might request the web page from a server that's close to you, and all that's happening in the background. It might not be one literal server somewhere. And again, by server, all we're just talking about is a computer, right? It is a machine that's job is to serve, right? To when a request is made to give you something, when the browser makes a request to get something, then the server is the one that serves that up. Same way that a waiter serves you up your meal after you've requested it from the menu, right? In a way, the web is just this massive menu of possible options that browsers can request, and the servers are all of these gazillions of waiters in all of these secure environments just waiting to get those requests and give them back to you, right? That's one silly way to think about it, okay? So keeping this distinction in mind, let's just try to go through all of the different scenarios that we just explained to figure out why they may or may not be secure. So if we think about the first method that we described, where we're actually going to hide the body here, we're going to hide it on page load, and there's going to be maybe some condition that decides when that element is actually going to become visible, right? Like the current user's role being admin. So if I go back to the admin page and I'll make sure that I disable this redirect so I can actually do, right? That body isn't viewable. So at first sight, okay, that seems pretty secure, okay? However, remember that all of the information about what actually is inside of that group, inside of this body here, is actually going to be sent along in this package here, right? If this is your application package, right, all of the files that are needed in order to turn or transform your application from binary digits being sent along a cable into an interactive web page, okay? All of that is included within this package here. And part of that package is all of this information about the body, the main container, and all that kind of stuff. And how do we know that? We know that because if I have here, let's say I just put a button in the header, and its only job here is to show the body group, okay? So this is going to show the body when it's clicked. So now what would happen when I click this is obviously the body is going to show. But what's interesting, if I just refresh the page, okay, I'm going to do a couple of things here. So right now, this is the page here, okay? This is the entire page of our application admin page, okay? So we can see that the hierarchy is emulated. Like we've got a top nav and we've got a body. So basically, we've got the body here, and then here is our top nav, okay? They're siblings of each other. They're at the same level in the hierarchy. So really, this page here is really containing the body of our app, although it's not reflected here in what is called the DOM or the HTML. I'm going to go over here to the network tab, okay? Now the network tab is tracking any request that our browser makes to some external system, okay? A request to view some new resource to do with the web page that maybe the server still has, okay? Like some new data, right? Every time that you update a data source, let's say that you add a fill to a repeating group data source that is going to request to get some new users or new posts or new products or whatever from the database, okay? What's actually happening there behind the scenes is the client is making a new request to the server to send it the new data, okay? Now, we can use this network tab to know whether or not the browser already has everything that it needs in that initial package that it's received in order to show the body, okay? If it doesn't, then it would need to make a separate request to the server to get some more information to render the body group here. And we would see that within the network tab. So if I click show body, nothing. I mean, there is two things. That's it. That's an absolute lie. But this msearch is actually a request for users in that database, and there's nothing in here, right? There's actually nothing in here because of the privacy rules that we set up, okay? And this bulk watch, well, we can see there's actually nothing in here. This is something else that Bubble is using. I don't know what for, but it clearly doesn't have any meaningful data in it. So that means that the initial request to view this admin page was responded with from the server a package of data that already had everything that was needed in order to render this body. So where did that actually live? Where does that information live? Again, come over to sources within DevTools. This is basically the package here, right? Like I've got some other kind of stuff here that's extensions that I'm using, but this one here, sensitive pages tutorial, like that's the app that I'm using, okay? There's three basically folders here of different files, which none of us can really read because this is all Bubble's own code base, right? This is the code base that Bubble is both using to transform the instructions that we give here into the editor into code that can actually render an interactive web page. And it's also the specific programming instructions, the specific things that we've told Bubble to configure for us for this page. Like for example, like all the workflows, all the UI, everything is encompassed within all of these files, okay? Now, I don't know exactly where this particular show body action lives. So I don't know myself how I would emulate this within these instructions, but there are various techniques that a motivated individual could use to start to target or to identify where that code actually lives and use it to expose the sensitive information that you may have within this body group, okay? So just because it's not obvious to you that information is actually being displayed doesn't mean that it cannot be accessed by a motivated actor, okay? The really important thing that we have to understand is that everything that the client receives can be unpacked, can be exposed, is by very nature accessible, okay? So if there's truly sensitive information, okay, that the user shouldn't have access to, it should never be available within this package. And that might sound like a really kind of complicated security topic. And it is by nature a little bit more complicated than some of the other things that we learn when we're going about learning Bubble and building our applications. But it needn't be super complicated, okay? This basic principle can take you a long way, just understanding that whatever the server sends to the client, okay, can't have truly sensitive information in it, right? So this workflow here, and by nature, all of the information encoded within this body group, right? Which, you know, in most cases isn't really going to have sensitive information in it unto itself, but perhaps it could. All of that is potentially accessible. So we don't really want to rely just on things like this, conditions like this, to be able to prevent users from accessing sensitive information. This is great. This is what can be called like obfuscating the information. It's making it harder to access, but it's just one strategy amongst many, and it's definitely not like the foolproof bulwark against hackers getting your information. Okay, so that's the hiding side of it. Now we also were talking about, well, what about on our pop-up? We've got an action here to make changes to a user. We now have a mental model for making sense of this, right? If I don't have these conditions right here, we know that all of the information about how to execute this action and this action, which we've decided are sensitive. We don't want anybody to be able to do them. We only want admins to be able to do them. We know that the information about these workflows and how to and the rules around when they get executed must be contained in this package. It has to be, because we're not going to do another request back to the server by default, just like this, right? There's nothing that we've set up here that suggests that would be the case. So that's why, if I go and undo here, okay, that's why we need some extra conditions. Now, the obvious question that you might have is, okay, but I have added a condition here, and that condition is part of this package, is it not? So couldn't a motivated actor remove this condition somehow, or trick this condition somehow, so that even if they didn't have the required permissions, they could fire this action? This is going into an area that you really have to read some of Bubble's documentation to understand. But the short answer is no, okay? The reason why is because this condition itself, the current user's role as admin, this isn't a condition that's going to be evaluated, or it's not a question that's going to be asked over here on the client, okay? It's not like the client is this totally self-contained environment that's going to ask itself, is the user an admin, right? And if it is, it's going to basically fire this workflow, then fire workflow, okay? This right here is not something that is going to be evaluated here on the client, okay? And the reason why is because all of the information that's required to evaluate this is actually information that the server has access to here. It's reliant on data in the database. And again, this is why I say it's something you have to read the Bubble manual to understand. And there's also a great book by Peter Amerly on Bubble security, which I'm going to link below, which explains this in more detail as well. But basically, anytime that the server here, or the back end of your application, the secure part by nature, right? It's in an isolated environment that the users can't access. Anytime that a condition can be evaluated on the server without any information present on the client, right? Then it will be evaluated on the server. What that basically means is that if I was to, okay, I've got current user's role as admin, let me go to my body here and just set this to be visible again. If I was to just add, here's a test user mail.com, give them a role, go over to my network tab. I'm just going to clear this out so it's easy to see what's happening. If I go add that user, okay, we can see that this was basically a request that was made, right? This is the request here to the server. And included in the request is basically what we wanted to do, like the changes that we wanted to make. And we don't necessarily need to know how all of this works, right? We don't need to understand all of the what's actually happening under the hood. But we can see here, if we go to response, we can see what the server responded with, okay? And they responded with basically a note here that says, actually, the condition failed, right? The condition failed here. And if we go into our database, make sure they refresh this, right? Actually, our test user isn't appearing here, okay? So that's just a crude way of demonstrating this principle in action, that this condition here, right? And also, although I haven't got my test email set up to prove it, but that it didn't actually fire. This action didn't fire because the server was able to evaluate this and decided that actually, because the current user isn't an admin, I'm not going to fire this action. It was something that was securely evaluated here on the server. And let's say we were going to do something different. Let's say we were going to, I don't know, we had a custom state on the admin, which was like, can create, and it's a yes/no field. This is a very silly example, but just to demonstrate it. If we were to say that this is only able to be fired when that admin page's can create is set to yes, okay? This wouldn't be secure. This wouldn't be secure because this custom state does not live on the server, right? It's not information that the server has access to. It's information that can and will be evaluated over on the client, right? So is custom state true? This is something that the client can execute themselves, right? The server by very nature doesn't have access to this information because the custom state could be changed by user behavior, right? The user could be clicking around doing stuff and could set that custom state here on the admin page to something else. So the server stays out of it because it has to, and that condition then is just going to be evaluated here within the browser. And what that means, of course, is that this condition itself, as well as the custom state, in theory, all of that information is there, even if it's in a convoluted, hard to access, confusing form, right? Embedded in the bubble code base, minified code base, as they'd call it. So it's not very human readable. In theory, it is all manipulatable, able to be manipulated by a motivated actor. Okay, so by nature, it's not secure. Okay, so that's how we would secure our workflows, right? So current user's role as admin, current user's role as admin. Okay, if the conditions nodes, you can think about it that way, if the bits of information that are being compared, so in this case, a option set, which the server can have access to, and the current user's role field, which is a data source, right? It lives in the database, which by nature is on the back end, right? It is accessible by the server. Now, those two pieces of information can be evaluated without any extra information that needs to be provided by the browser or by the client. For example, a custom state or whether a group is visible or not, right? These are all information. This is all information that is stored client side, stored within the memory, the working memory of the browser that the user is using to access your website. If that's not the case, then the server will take care of it for us. Now, it's important to note here that when we're talking about securing these actions, we're securing actions that are actually going to happen on the server, okay? We can't secure an action that's going to happen here on the client, like showing or hiding pop-ups, setting custom states, right? That's all manipulating data, manipulating information that is here living within the browser. So even if the browser is going to go and ask the server to do a check, like, hey, is the current user an admin, right? Before we decide whether we're going to hide the pop-up. Okay, it's a meaningless thing to do because even if the server tells us that, yeah, the current role is an admin, okay, the code that is actually going to be used to hide this pop-up is something that already lives within the client, right? So it can already be manipulated, right? And in anything to do with the UI, right? How the application actually looks, like that is all fairly trivial to manipulate, okay? So none of that sort of stuff is secure, but there's actually no real reason why you would want to do this condition anyway. It's just to illustrate the more general principle, okay? But then here's a trick question, and one that we left open somewhat at the beginning. If I have the condition here, and I say the current user's role is admin, and I don't have it here, is this secure? What's actually being prevented at this point? Yes, the current user's role is admin. Okay, so knowing what we know, this is basically going to be something that the server is going to evaluate, and maybe we can test it out by doing a test user again, right? And if we go clear out this network tab, we hit add user, what happens? Looks like there was a request to do something and the application actually responded with some information about the current user, okay? This is basically what the server responded with. So this actually corresponds with this condition here, current user's role as admin, right? The server did that check and returned that information to this workflow to decide whether or not it could go forth. Actually, as it turns out, I'm not even entirely sure if it looks like in this case, like all the server has done is return this information to the browser so that it can be used and evaluated within this condition. But the condition itself is actually being evaluated here on the machine, on the client machine. And that makes sense, right? Because this is just a trigger for a workflow based on a button click. So the code, in whatever form it's in, which has encoded this command, right? That when X button is clicked, we're going to trigger these actions, right? That lives client side, right? That lives here within the browser. It lives here within this package, meaning it can be tampered with, meaning someone could manipulate it. Even though we have this condition, all somebody has to do is basically find, I say all they have to do like it's super trivial, but in theory, it's not that complicated. They just have to find out where the trigger event is in the code base for this command, right? And then amend the code so that this condition isn't part of it. And then all of a sudden they can run all of these guys. Okay? But going back now to our kind of original setup, if these conditions live on an action which itself is going to be executed on the server, create an account, send a password reset. These are both things that are going to happen over here. Then the server is going to do the full check as to whether or not those conditions allow for those actions to take place. It's going to do those checks itself without relying anything here on the client, meaning that it can't be manipulated with, because even the most motivated actor, okay, isn't going to hack your server. And if they do, we've all got bigger problems, right? That is not something that they're going to be able to do. So that's why we have the conditions living here at the action level. Okay, the action level of the actions that are going to be evaluated on the server. Okay, now these are all good things to understand, especially if we're doing things like designing pages where we basically have some users who can do some things on the page and other users who can't do other things on the page, right? Which is a common scenario, right? Depending on the user's subscription status or role, they cannot access some kind of sensitive information, or there's some workflows that they're not authorized to execute, that kind of thing, right? So in those scenarios, we want to be thinking about securing the particular actions that we need to. But coming back to the first general example, which is, truth be told, where I started wanting to focus on mostly in this video, although we've tried to be a little bit more comprehensive as we've gone along, is if we have a page where really the rule is quite simple. Like if you're an admin, you can view this page. If you're not an admin, you can't. Or you might say if you're logged in, you can view this page. And if you're logged out, then you can't, right? If it's at the page level where our security check needs to happen, then both the simplest and the most secure way is to prevent this page, the page itself, from even being sent, right? We're going to prevent this package from even leaving the server. Okay, so how do we do that? We need to have this pages loaded event that we showed before. And if we add a custom state here on the admin page, which is secured, it's a secured custom state. Is it secured or not? And it's a yes or no field. And let's say that by default, it is secured, okay? And we only want to redirect the user then when that secured value is yes. If I reload this page, watch what happens. Just keep an eye on the page. Okay, there it is. It's loaded, and then we redirect it off. Okay, interesting. Let me try something else for a second here. I'm going to tick this guy, and I'll explain what they do in a minute. If I go back to my admin page, load and gone. Okay, so I'm going to try to explain to you what just happened. Okay, within this network tab, remember all this network tab is doing is tracking the requests from the browser back to the server and then the responses that come back. What I'm doing here in configuring this is I'm filtering by docs, okay, and the docs actually just represent like whole web pages of our application. So this admin here is actually a request to view the admin page that our browser made. Our browser asked the server to send back the admin page, okay? So that's what this request means here. And these two aren't super important. I'm just ensuring that after we're redirected, I still have these logs here that my browser isn't saving any information locally, so it has to request the information from the server each time that the page is refreshed. That's what this disable cache does. Now, what I want to point your attention to here is this 200 code, okay? Now, what that means in the world of the web, these requests, when the server gets a request for anything, it responds with a particular type of code that tells the requester, that tells the client, the status of their request, whether or not it was successful, or whether it was malformed, or whether they sent the right credentials, but they're not actually authorized, all kinds of different things, okay? All of these requests here are what are called HTTP requests, which is just a protocol, right? An agreed upon structure for how these requests should look, right? And that structure, without going into it too much, is basically this. You've got a headers section, and depending on the type of call, you might also have a body, you might also have the payloads that you're sending with it. And then there's a response that happens, okay? That's not super important right now. The important thing to note is that there are these types of codes that have to be sent in the response that tell the client, basically, it helps them make sense of the status of their request. So the 200 is the most common. 200, okay. It means that it was successful, right? Your request to get this resource, right? To get this web page, in our case, it was successful. And that kind of makes sense because we saw the admin page load up for a minute and then we got redirected. What that is telling us is very interesting, okay? It tells us that this admin page, and by nature, all of the information related to how that admin page should function, right? All of the conditional rules and the UI, all of that within the package actually arrived here within the browser. One of the things within this package, one of the little pieces of information was basically some redirect logic, right? It was a tiny little bit of logic encapsulated this. When the page is loaded, check to see whether the admin secured custom state value is yes, and if so, we're going to go to page index, okay? That little piece of code, which is actually represented in JavaScript, which you probably heard about, right? That's the kind of the underlying language of the web in terms of making stuff happen, interactivity, logic, actions, right? Initiative. That little instruction, that command was within this package when it came through to the browser, okay? And then what happened was the browser unpacked this package of information, right? And it interpreted it and it processed it all and it found this bit of logic, it found that command and it executed it, right? It executed it. And then what it did was it basically made a new request based on this logic to the server to get a new web page, i.e. the index page. And that's what we see here. We see, okay, there was actually a second request made to the index page, right? This is the index page version test. And of course, the client complied with that request. It was again successful. And here we find ourselves on the index page. Now, what's wrong with this? What's wrong with this, of course, is that the browser received everything to do with this web page before it was redirected, okay? So even if it's for a split second, it's a kind of a trivial thing. I could go to the admin page and if I'm fast enough, I can hit that close button and then here we go. Like I've stopped the execution, the processing of this package before this redirect logic was passed or was processed. And so now here I am on the page and I can dig in here and I can go into the sources and look, here's all the code related to this web page. And now I can just spend my sweet time going through all of this and trying to understand how I extract some kind of sensitive information or how I trick the code into thinking that I'm an admin so I can create a new user or whatever, right? Obviously, that's not a good thing. What we started out wanting to do was stop this page being returned to the client, returned to the browser altogether. But we can see here within the network tab, these are our old versions, but we can see here's the latest one. Okay, it was returned. It was returned to the browser. What we want to do is prevent that, right? So we want to prevent, if this is the web page, this is the document, we want to stop that getting to the browser. Okay, we want the server to keep it there, so to speak, and to send us somewhere else. Knowing what we know about this relationship, okay, how might we go about doing that? All we want to do is we want to give the server an instruction that it can execute itself, okay? That it doesn't need to rely on any information that's living here within the browser. Now, of course, this custom state is a piece of information that lives within the browser. And so by nature, this whole package has to come here first, be unpacked, then it has to find that logic, and then it can execute it. Okay, and as we've seen, there's security problems with that, right? So what we want is we want the server to have some information that it can evaluate outside of what the page is doing, outside of what the browser knows. And so one of those conditions, the same way as we're having it here, is when we're checking data, right? We're checking, is something true in relation to the database, right? Anything to do with the database is something that can be evaluated on the server. So when the current user's role is not admin, right? That's something that in theory, the server can take care of. And the important thing that we have to know here is that when we're setting this kind of thing up, okay, it's just the first action in a page is loaded event that gets evaluated in this way. That's where this condition needs to live, okay? And we don't want to have any other actions here afterwards. We just keep it right here, okay? That's just the way that Bubble needs it to work, and it makes sense even if it's not necessarily the most intuitive or well-documented thing. So let's go back to the admin page now. And I've got the network tab open. We're recording what's happened. Something very interesting. We're seeing a different status code here, something called a 302. And if we look at what a 302 means, okay, and I'm using here something called the internet to find that out. Okay, let's see what a 302 means. It says that the response code means that the URI, which is the unique resource identifier, slightly different than a URL, but it's a broader term, okay, it's been changed temporarily. Okay, we may make some updates in the URI in the future. Okay, what that means, in other words, is that this URI, the unique resource identifier, is essentially the location of this resource. Okay, the place that we want to look. Whenever somebody goes to find the admin page, the URI, which would previously give them the admin page, the URI is now pointing to our index page, right? That's the location now, essentially, of our admin page under these conditions, okay? That's the code that the server has responded with after we requested this admin page. So what happened was we requested to view, remember this is all HTTP, we requested to view that admin page. The server then did some processing over here, did some processing to figure out, hey, is the admin on the user? And as it turns out, it's not in our case. And so then what it did is it responded with two things. It responded with a 302, right, which is this guy here, just a 302. And then it basically sent a second response. So this was respond with 302. And then here it responded with the index page, okay? Which is basically saying that, yeah, this index page is the place that we're redirecting you to in light of this 302. So that's why this index page was now sent instead. If I was to say, okay, when the current user's role is admin, then we want to redirect them, which is obviously a silly example, but remember that I'm currently logged in as a user who's a standard type user. So if I try to go to the admin page now, okay, the request was made to the admin page and now it's successful. It returns a 200 and it returns everything to do with the page, right? Like here's all of the information to do with the page, as well as basically links to other documents, scripts that are needed to make this page happen. And all of those can be found here, right? All of those can be found under the sources section. Not that we necessarily know how to make sense of them, right? But this at least gives us a sense for what's happening under the hood and why some ways of protecting our application are better than others, okay? So this is quite a sort of a deep technical, somewhat technical topic, right? But I've shown a few different pieces here and I've tried to dig into the dev tools here just to keep illustrating this one fundamental point, which is that anything that arrives here on the browser is by nature insecure. Anything that is evaluated, processed on the server is by nature secure. So when we're dealing with sensitive information, we need to be thinking about this distinction, right? We need to be thinking about how do we get the server to do the work here and only return non-sensitive information back to the browser. And all these different sort of techniques of where to add these conditions, this is just Bubble's way of handling this basic distinction, right? This is the web, right? This is not Bubble. This is how web pages and the internet functions fundamentally. Okay, there's requests from clients to servers and there's responses that come back. When we're configuring our Bubble application, we obviously have this different kind of interface for the way that we set the rules around when certain requests should be stopped, basically, or when they should be responded with an error or with some kind of unauthorized message or a redirect. Okay, so I hope that's been helpful. I know that's quite a lot of information. I'm super curious if you have any questions, if certain parts of this weren't clear. Please do leave them below. Let us know what you're building. And as always, happy Bubble.